So what I want to do first is really just say what we're going to cover, what kind of questions we're going to try and examine in this talk. And this is really the defining question of this webinar and of the presentation that I'm about to make, is what is the relationship between climate change and conflict? How is it that changes in the climate, changes in incidents of disasters, changes in patterns of rainfall, drought or extreme weather events interact with armed violence and conflict, or violence more broadly? And what do we know about those relationships? What does the evidence tell us about them? And how can we understand what those relationships are? I also want to say a little bit about what this session is and isn't. I think a lot of people approach this topic wanting to know a very clear answer. They want to know, is life on a hotter planet going to be one with more violence and conflict? And although this session will help you understand that, I'm not going to present a conclusive answer. Rather, what I'm going to do is hopefully give you a set of analytical tools and an understanding that enables you yourselves to look at this question. Because the world is a very big and complicated place, as we all know, and it isn't necessarily possible just to offer a simple answer to the question, well, will we experience more violence on a hotter planet? So rather than try to offer up what would inevitably be a very simplistic answer, rather what I'm going to do is walk you through how we can understand this topic, how the scholars and academics who work in this field have built up an understanding of it. And as we begin to understand how we can make sense of these relations, then you'll have a toolkit of your own, an understanding, a kind of a grasp, if you like, of how these things interact with each other, enabling you to then apply that thinking to your own work, to your own communications, to your advocacy, in the way that is most useful for you as an organisation. So what you're not going to come away with is a simple answer, but I hope what I am going to begin to give you over this session is a set of much more useful tools that you can use to reach your own conclusions and reach the kind of answers and kind of insights that you'll need for your own work. So before we start, we need to really have a little bit of an understanding of what we mean by conflict. And I'm going to use the phrase very, very broadly in this session. And that may be something that can be perhaps slightly confusing when you're delving into some of the literature and academic research yourself. Conflict or armed violence or war often have very specific meanings that apply perhaps very specifically in a particular part of the field. But for this session, really when I say conflict or when I say armed violence or when I say violence more generally, I'm referring to a number of different things, ranging right from interstate warfare, where one country goes to war with another, down to things that are more like interpersonal violence, when one or more humans interact with each other violently, something much more akin to what we would usually call violent crime. Now, the reason that I'm taking this very, very broad approach is because this is roughly the approach that the field takes. This is the approach that is taken by many of the scholars working on this area. So while individual pieces of research or individual studies or individual papers might look at a very, very tightly defined, very specific kind of conflict or violence, when we look at this literature as a whole, it covers all sorts of different things, right from these, kind of large-scale wars right down to kind of more individual incidents of violent crime. Now, I'm not suggesting that all of these different types of violence have the same drivers or that they can necessarily be considered as one. But nonetheless, what I want to try and do is unpick, as we go through this session, how these different types of violence are influenced differently by changes in the environment. So that's why you'll hear me throughout this talk sometimes referring to conflict or armed conflict very generally, but other points referring to specific kinds of violence, where and when the studies that I'm talking about are specifically about those kinds of violence. So the language is important, but this talk is going to cover a range of different forms of conflict. So the second thing we need to look at is exactly how is it that we know about the relationship between climate change and conflict? How is it that we can move beyond speculation or guessing? How is it that we can say with some certainty what this kind of relationship is, rather than just sort of going with our gut reaction or going with pieces of anecdotal evidence? There are three key ways of doing this, in my view. The first one is through data and correlation, and that form of investigation is actually what this session is going to focus on most. It's not the only way of trying to understand this link. It's not the only way of understanding the climate conflict nexus. Another key method in this area of research is simply asking people. It often is possible to ask people who have been caught up in episodes of armed conflict or other kinds of violence what they believe are the drivers behind that episode of violence taking place, and their own understanding of the conflict that they were caught up in or involved in some way is very important as well. It's also possible to use various kinds of mixed method studies where, for example, an individual location is examined and existing evidence from all kinds of other fields is drawn together to try and build up a picture of how or why a particular location experienced an episode of conflict or violence. And within that, it may be that evidence around changes in the environment, changes in patterns of disasters, plays a part in building up that case study. These, in my view, are all key methods in understanding what this relationship is. But as I said, mainly what we're going to focus on is this first one of using data and looking for correlation. So, the first thing then that we need to understand is, where does this data come from? If we're looking for correlations between two different kinds of data, two different data sets, on the one hand between changes in the environment and climate change, and on the other changes in patterns of conflict, where do we get this data from? So the first thing I want to look at is, where do we get our data about conflict from? So there are actually a number of different sources, and what I'm showing you here is from the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. And for a number of decades, this unit has been compiling evidence on the incidents, the number of people injured and killed, civilians and soldiers in war and conflict. And we can do interesting things with this data even before we start to consider its relationship with environmental change or climate change. So what you can see there in front of you is a fairly straightforward graph showing the number of conflict battle deaths of both soldiers and civilians from just after the Second World War until pretty much the present day. So we actually have at our disposal a very, very rich set of data looking at conflict. The PRIO data, which is shown to you there, is not the only data set looking at conflict. There are other ones as well. We also, of course, have access to data on violent crime, as most countries produce crime statistics, and those are often publicly available. There are also other data sets looking at more specific kinds of conflict, such as terrorism, or more specifically focusing on particular regions. So we actually have a great deal of data at our disposal when we start trying to investigate this question of what is the link between climate change and conflict. There is data there that can help us. Now, most of the data on conflict, of course, is spatial in some sense. So what you can see there is a map created using the same data set, but showing the number of conflict battle deaths, again, both civilians and soldiers, by country over the same, roughly over the same time period as my previous slide. What I'm trying to show here is that this data in many ways is actually quite sophisticated. It's time-bound, it tells you when those conflict deaths occurred, it's spatial, it tells you which country they happened in. So we can begin to build up quite sophisticated pictures of what is going on globally. Much of this data as well is also very spatial in a very, very detailed way. So again, same data set. We can see incidents of conflict, battle, deaths there for a particular region. And rather than just showing the country that they took place in, they are actually geolocated. So you can see the kind of very specific location that they occurred in, right down usually to the town or village that they happened in. My point here is that the data that we have available is very sophisticated, it's time-bound, it's often geospatial, and we can start to use that kind of very rich data to begin to try and answer this question of how is it, in what ways does climate change alter these patterns of conflict that we can see in this data. So the second part of the equation, data on weather and climate change. Now, this in some ways perhaps is more obvious, more commonly understood. Of course, we have a great deal of information about the weather. For centuries, we've been collecting data about rainfall, about temperature, about air pressure, but we've also been collecting data about what we might consider more to be the impacts of weather, for example, on drought, on desertification. Further, we collect data on the incidence of disasters, on how often floods occur and how severe those floods are, on how long droughts last, on how frequently typhoons and hurricanes strike and the severity of those strikes. So again, we have this very rich set of data in a number of different databases that we can then use to try and examine this. So here I've just got a couple of examples to show you. Here's data on drought. This is actually from the United States, but it just shows over the last 15 or so years the severity of the droughts that have taken place. Again, this is data on flooding. This shows the incident of extreme precipitation events, so years in which rainfall has been particularly out of its usual pattern. We don't need to delve a great deal into each one of these different data sets and how they work and what they record. The key point I'm making is that we have both data about changes in our environment or extreme events taking place that are related to the weather, and data on armed conflict and where and when it happens. So broadly, if we want to sketch out a very, very rough research methodology for looking at this, this is what scholars have been doing over the last few decades. You take a data set on some aspect of our changing environment, some aspect of the weather, whether that's rainfall, drought, hurricane strikes, the list goes on, and then you take one of the data sets on conflict and you look for a correlation. And that broadly, I've very oversimplified it, but that broadly is the methodology that is used for trying to understand these links. So the big question is, and what's the answer? Is there a relationship between climate change and armed conflict? When researchers combine these data sets and apply statistical tests to look for a correlation, what is it that they find? Now, I don't want to offer a kind of simple generalized answer here, so what I'm going to do is try and unpack what a number of different studies have found. So, if you remember right at the beginning of the presentation, I said that there were these different kinds of conflict that we were going to look at, different kinds of violence that we were going to examine. So rather than try and offer a kind of general answer here, what we can do is say, well, which of these kind of forms of armed conflict or violence do have a link to changes in the environment or changes in the climate? Now, the first thing to note is that you can see on the slide there a lot of question marks, and I'm going to come to that in a minute. The first one to note, though, is that there's actually very little relationship, or kind of no discernible relationship, between any environmental changes and interstate war. So one country, a national government, taking its army to war with the army of another state. There doesn't seem to be in the various studies that have been carried out a link there between that kind of armed violence and changes in the environment. The rest of them have got question marks next to them, and I'm about to explain why. So when it comes to civil war, intercommunal conflict, which is where you have two non-state groups fighting each other, interpersonal violence and violence crime, and episodes of rioting and civil disturbance, what you find is that these studies are very mixed. Many of them show a link between changes in the environment, changes in the weather, and an uptick in armed conflict or violence of some sort. Many of them show no relationship at all, and many of them show the opposite effect, that these changes in the environment produce a decrease in armed conflict. That's why they've got question marks next to them. So what we know is that these four kinds of conflict, civil war, intercommunal conflict, interpersonal violence, rioting, that in some cases and in some locations, climate change, or the impacts of climate change, perhaps we should say, does seem to be changing these patterns. But in interstate warfare, it seems that it is not. So what I want to do now is sort of delve into exactly what's going on here with each of these different forms of violence. So the big question that comes up is, okay, in the cases where it does seem apparent that climate change or its impacts is producing this change in a pattern of conflict, well, why is that? What is it about the change in the environment that leads people who may have been on the edge of armed conflict for a while to then fully pursue that armed conflict? What is the causal mechanism, to use the research language, that drives that? The researchers usually have established a correlation. They've established that these things to some extent go in lockstep. Or perhaps more accurately, I should say, some of the studies looking at some particular locations have established that there does seem to be a correlation, while others have shown that there isn't. So in these instances where there does seem to be a correlation, what is the driving force? What's the causal link or the causal chain between these changes in the environment and this alteration in a pattern of armed conflict? Now, again, the reason that I've put these question marks here is because most of the authors of these studies say that while they've found a correlation, they are unclear about exactly what the causal link is. And some of them sort of speculate, some of them say, well, we think it might be these certain factors, but in typical research language, more research will be needed to fully investigate. But the things that are often pointed at are conflict over resources, opportunism, which is where the disruption of a disaster or of some kind of sudden alteration in the environment presents the opportunity to either pursue an act of violent crime or to kind of prosecute an act of armed conflict. The chaos that's created becomes the opportunity to do that. Migration, so when people are forced to move from one place to another as a result of some other kind of environmental change, do they then come into contact with people, and does that trigger an armed conflict? I'm personally more skeptical about that one. I think that in general, migration isn't usually a driving force of armed violence. However, nonetheless, this is something that is hinted at and pointed at in the literature. So we do need to kind of list it there as something that's discussed. The final one, and perhaps the strangest, is this question of psychology. And this applies more to the research linking environmental change, climate change impacts with interpersonal violence or violent crime. And it's the idea that for various psychological reasons, which as yet remain slightly opaque in the research literature, people find that the disturbance makes them more likely to commit acts of violence. So this is quite unsettling in some ways, but there are a number of studies that point to this being the case. So, for example, in the United States, there's research evidence pointing to the fact that, more violent crimes happen on days that are kind of exceptionally hotter. So we have this question of whether there is something about the psychological aspects of the environment around us that can make some people more likely to commit acts of violence. So those are the proposed causal mechanisms that link these things. It's also worth saying that they're all quite deeply contested. And what I want to do here is not to say that these are never going to be drivers of armed conflict, that these are not the causes, not part of the causal chain linking climate change to armed conflict, but rather to point out that within the research literature, there are people who argue for and against these being part of the causal mechanism. So, for example, when it comes to resources, what we find is scholars on the one hand saying, well, we think that it is perhaps access to water or access to usable cropland or grazing land that is driving these incidents of conflict. And as climate change begins to prevent people accessing water, for example, through drought, as it begins to lead to various water sources drying up, or as climate change begins to affect various kind of pieces of rangeland that people access for grazing or for growing, that the competition over water or land moves from being one in which a sort of uneasy peace is kept to one in which people revert to armed conflict in order to try and establish their access to those resources. Now that certainly sounds plausible, and I think if you look across the world, you do see cases where that happens. However, it's also the case that very often disputes over resources are resolved peacefully. So the vast majority of interstate conflicts over, for example, access to rivers are resolved through diplomatic means. People all over the world, of course, on a daily basis resolve conflicts over land and water access without turning to violence. So the detractors of this idea say, well, actually, we can't make any generalizations here. We can't say universally that shrinking resources and disputes over access to those resources is going to lead to conflict. Because in many places and in numerous examples, those conflicts are resolved peacefully. So they add a note of caution. Resource scarcity and competition over resources doesn't always lead to violence. So we need some additional level of analysis that says, well, in the cases where that does happen, what are the other factors that mean that it is so? The question of opportunism is interesting as well, and again, as with resources, has become an area of hot academic dispute. On the one hand, people say that, for example, the aftermath of a natural disaster, like a hurricane, typhoon strike, or episode of extreme flooding, becomes the opportunity when either a terrorist organization or a group of armed rebels may decide that this is the time, this is the chance in which they're going to begin to prosecute their armed rebellion or their invasion or whatever form whatever form of armed conflict they have been intending. And that rather than being a cause on its own, rather it becomes the point in time at which this group decides to carry out this piece of armed conflict. Now, on the one hand, that sounds plausible, and there was a lot of discussion, there was a lot of talk about this after the floods in Pakistan in 2010. However, the detractors of this point say, well, actually, if you ask people on the ground, or even if you ask people who in the past have been involved in these kinds of activities, they say, actually, this wasn't a key driver. This wasn't the time that they used. This wasn't essentially an act of opportunism. Final one that I want to look at in a bit more detail is migration. I said before that I have my own reservations about this, But I think that because it's talked about in the literature a lot, we do need to examine it to some extent. The thesis goes roughly that as climate change begins to take hold, as it leads to changes in the environment, especially droughts and sudden disasters, people will move, and as they move, they will encounter new people that will lead to them essentially entering into episodes of armed violence between newly arrived migrants and existing residents. Now, while there are some case studies that point to this, so for example, you may remember a couple of years ago in 2015, there was a big study that suggested that this may have been part of the genesis of the conflict in Syria. I think it's also worth noting, however, that most of the migration that takes place anywhere in the world happens without armed conflict. In general, migration has not been a driver of armed violence in the past, so we shouldn't necessarily expect that it suddenly will be in the future. It's also worth noting that it's far more likely that people will be moving, that people will be displaced by conflict, rather than refugees and migrants being a source of armed conflict themselves. So sometimes I think that part of this discourse is sort of back to front. Nonetheless, these four things, resources, opportunism, migration, and psychology, are usually the suggestions of the causative forces or the causal links that you'll encounter as you delve into this literature. But it is, as I hope I've demonstrated, the case that each of them is still fairly contested, even within the field. What I want to talk about next is a series of meta-studies, or studies of studies. So, over the last, say, decade, a huge number of individual pieces of research, of correlative research, have been done exploring the links between climate change and conflict, using roughly the methodology that I outlined earlier on in the talk. And as I've also said, many of these studies pointed to an increase in armed conflict. Some found no correlation, and others found a decrease. So this led people to think, well, okay, it's understandable that these studies point in different directions. Of course, the world is a very different and diverse place, and of course, a particular kind of weather event happening in one location may increase armed conflict, but the same kind of event happening in a different location may have a completely different effect. And that's exactly what we should expect, because no two places are identical. Nonetheless, what people wanted to know, the burning question of many politicians and policymakers was, okay, but in general, if we look globally, is climate change going to mean that there is overall more armed conflict? So a number of different researchers set about trying to answer this global question, trying to come up with a general answer by using all of these studies that had gone before. They carried out what in the research language is called meta-studies, where they combine the data from a number of different studies and try to reach a more general answer. Now, the first one of these found a very powerful and very significant connection between climate change and conflict. The researchers in this first meta-study essentially concluded that when taken as a whole, this set of literature, these several hundred papers that they gathered, did in fact point to a significant increase. They said that this had happened in the past. They said that they could establish that generally disruptions in weather led to more armed conflict, and they believed this with enough surety that they could make predictions about what would happen in the future, that with every degree of global warming that we experience, this would lead to further disruptions in the weather, and that these further disruptions would lead to further armed conflict. Essentially, the conclusion they reached was an extremely worrying one, that although some places might be insulated from this effect, and while there might be exceptions, that broadly in the future, a hotter planet would be one with more conflict. Now, this study was then challenged by a second study, which took a very similar collection of papers, but reached a fairly opposite conclusion. Well, perhaps not an opposite conclusion. They didn't find that climate change would lead to less armed conflict, but broadly, they re-looked at the studies that the first study had looked at and said, actually, when we consider these together, we are not finding a general global upward trend. We're not finding that globally, when we experience more climate change, we also experience more conflict. So I think it's worth examining briefly why these two meta-studies, why these two global studies reach different conclusions. The first one is about the individual studies that each set of scholars decided to put in the mix. The first study included several hundred studies, but also included studies that went back historically quite far into the past. So it looked at studies that looked at changes in rainfall pattern and civilizational collapse from several hundred or even thousand years ago. The second group of researchers said, well, actually, society is so different now. Maybe we shouldn't have those kind of studies in the mix. Maybe we can't draw conclusions from the collapse of an ancient civilization to armed conflict in our modern society. So they took those studies out. They also used slightly different statistical methods for comparing the data from the studies, but at the end, the final result was that one group of researchers found that there was this powerful link globally, generally, and the other group of researchers found that there wasn't. So this leaves us in a kind of tricky position, because which of these two studies do we believe? Which one do we think is correct? Now, the useful way that I found to deal with this academic dispute is to say, well, perhaps trying to reach these general conclusions isn't necessarily what we should be doing. Perhaps it isn't possible to think about the world in such a general way. And perhaps what we should do is return to the original papers that went into these meta-studies and consider them individually. Perhaps we should start thinking specifically and locally rather than generally and globally. Perhaps it's more useful to be able to say, well, what these studies do, these individual studies, as opposed to the meta-studies, is actually highlight the locations that we need to be concerned about. They point to the places where, for various reasons, changes in the weather will lead to increases in armed conflict. And they point to the areas where, for all sorts of reasons, certain places are insulated against that effect. Now, as the planet warms, that kind of information becomes incredibly useful because it's the kind of information that we need in order to direct resources around peace building and conflict prevention. So my take on this academic controversy that resulted from the meta-studies is actually, well, perhaps we can't answer that global question, but perhaps it is a local and specific question that is actually more important, because at the end of the day, conflicts happen somewhere, and it is in those places that resources will be needed to try and prevent those conflicts happening. So the individual studies are actually more useful, in my view, than the meta-studies which try to reach a universal global conclusion. What I hope I've done there is give you a bit of a sense of one of the big controversies within the field. The reason that I wanted to do it is partly, to give you my own take on how to navigate it, but also because this controversy between these two sets of researchers looking at this global question, I think, is going to run and run. And it's important for us as advocates or campaigners or people working in policy to be able to say, well, perhaps it is true that we can't reach a global conclusion. But nonetheless, we do know about these specific locations where it does seem to be a problem, and those are the places that we need to focus on. What I want to say now, just as a kind of way of summing up, is something about how we respond to this. What do we do? And I think the responses really fall into two kind of categories. And what I'm talking about here is politically how we respond. How do we respond in terms of policy, in action? What do governments do? So we're moving here from examining the research and the evidence to asking questions about, well, as a society, as a country, as a government, as an NGO, or as whoever it is you are, how do you react to this? What are the options on the table? And I want to say something kind of briefly about what they are. Now, The way that many states react to this information is to see it as a hard security question. Now, of course, they're right, because armed conflict is a security issue. But I think it's always important to ask, when we're talking about this, security for who? So, for example, when you hear representatives of developed countries like the United Kingdom, where I'm from, or the United States, or perhaps the European Union, saying we think that there is a link between climate change and conflict, and this is a security question for us, it is always worth asking, well, for whom exactly is this a security problem? Because what I find often in the discourse around this is that when developed country governments talk about this, what they mean is it's a security problem, not necessarily domestically for them, but perhaps for their interests in the countries that are more likely to be impacted. And if we delve into the literature, what we find, of course, is that it is countries that are already the poorest countries, already the most vulnerable, that are more likely to experience episodes of conflict that may have a link to climate change. So this question of climate change and security, I think, is important because it is, if you like, the mainstream discourse, the way that this issue is talked about most often. But I think the question that is always worth asking is, well, when we're talking about security, when we're saying climate change has a security dimension, or when we're saying that climate-linked conflict is a security problem, it is always worth saying, well, who is it that we are securing here? Who are we providing security for? I hope that what I've done there is very briefly, because I appreciate we only really have an hour for this whole session, is very briefly provide you with a way of jumping into this issue. I think in an hour, it really isn't possible to provide a kind of comprehensive overview of the whole thing. But I hope what I've done is give a brief explanation of, firstly, how we can understand this question. Secondly, what a lot of the evidence points to. And then finally, just this question of security, and perhaps what I think is as the point in which politically, or in terms of policy, we need to be fairly critical about how governments respond to this, and this idea of who gets secured by our security interventions.